organization promoting understanding and enlightenment on global issues. Welcome once again. My name is Mike. I'll be host and MC for today's presentation. Very timely presentation. Great speaker lined up. Lynn will be on in a minute to introduce her. And as usual, we're streaming live to Facebook. We're going to have live Q&A following our presentation today. So start entering your questions into chat if you're a member joining us on Zoom, or into Facebook if you're watching us that way. As we go through the presentation, I have everybody muted as they're coming into the room, so please just keep yourselves muted. If you do want to join live, we've got video and audio to ask questions. Again, just let me know in the chat and I'll help coordinate that as we get to the Q&A part of our meeting. And with that, I will turn things over to Lynn for our speaker introduction.
Great, Mike. Thanks so much. We're honored to have Dr. Victoria Tin Boer Hoyt with us today. I've heard her speak actually many times in various webinars, and she's been extremely busy in the last week with all the new events happening in Hong Kong and the China relationship. Dr. Hoyt received her PhD in political science from Columbia University and her BSS in journalism from the Chinese University of Hong Kong. She's on the faculty of Notre Dame. Her core research examines the centrality of war in the formation and transformation of China in the long span of history. But of course, with all events coming on recently, she also studies contentious politics. As a native from Hong Kong, she's written, "Will China Crush the Protests in Hong Kong? Why Beijing Doesn't Need to Send in the Troops in Foreign Affairs, and Hong Kong's Umbrella Movement, The Protest and Beyond," in the Journal of Democracy. She also maintains a blog on Hong Kong events. She has extensively commented on Hong Kong politics in the media, including the Washington Post's Monkey Cage, China File, ABC, the BBC, the New York Times, The Guardian, Bloomsburg, Sky News, NPR, Vox, and the Christian Science Monitor. She's very busy these days. We're honored to have her. Dr. Hoy, thank you so much for being with us today. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Lynn, and thank you, Mike, for having me. And so Hong Kong really needs a lot of attention. And this is a very sad moment, and there are many different ways to explain how Beijing has killed Hong Kong. But my daughter was talking to me, and then she's like, why don't you take a more personal journey to connect these different dots? So Lynn was so kind to explain that. I grew up in Hong Kong, and I also got my undergrad degree. I went to Chinese University of Hong Kong. And afterwards, I got a job in Hong Kong. The first job I worked with a railway company, and it was very boring. And then within a year, I quit and then began to work for the then Hong Kong Democratic Party. And the chair is Martin Lee, and Martin Lee is known as the father of Hong Kong's democracy movement. And when I was getting married, I asked Martin to give me away. And then when my daughter was born, Martin also became the godfather. So this is kind of like, I'm going to talk about how Hong Kong basically is dying through this. And then another thing is when we are taking can everyone see my screen? Is it already shared, or do I have to do something more?
Doesn't look like you're sharing yet. You might want to restart the sharing.
So let me make sure. So is this?
Yes, now we see it.
Okay, great. So these days, what keeps me from falling asleep is in particular, a whole bunch of things basically makes me lose sleep. But there are two people in particular I care the most about. So on April 18th, 15 pro-democracy activist leaders were arrested in one big sweep. They were charged for participating in, organizing, inciting others in a very peaceful demonstration on August 31st last year. And among these people, two I'm particularly concerned, as I mentioned Martin Lee, because essentially his family. And then another person is Li Cheyan, and I'm going to explain. So Martin Lee, as I said, I worked for him at the time. And so also that early on, Lynn was joking that, my core research is Chinese history. But these days I've been working on Hong Kong a lot. And I also remember that, so when I went to grad school, I actually wanted to learn more about how to understand Hong Kong. But once I got into grad school, I became interested in Chinese history. And I realized that a lot of the party lines about China never expanded in history, or there was never any root for constitutional checks and balance. All of those things basically have no basis in history. And then I went back to Hong Kong and I told Martin, so I'm working on Chinese history. He was like, Victoria, there are all these things about Hong Kong that you can work on. Why don't you work on Hong Kong? Well, now that maybe at a very, very critical time, they actually have a lot more knowledge and expertise and political science theories to understand Hong Kong. And then another person that I'm really worried about is Li Cheyan. Li Cheyan is also a family friend. And in fact, I kind of became interested in politics even before I began my undergrad studies in Hong Kong. I studied journalism because at the time, my mother, she would go to the labor union that Li Cheyan organized. And so now and then she would bring me along. So when I was just 17, 18, I was already interested in politics. I was also present at the first ever pro-democracy gathering of all the forces, essentially the birth moment of the Hong Kong democracy movement. Now I'm particularly worried about Li Cheyan because Martin, he and others, they were arrested for organizing, inciting unlawful assemblies for what happened on August 31st last year. And that was utterly peaceful. And then at the same time that they would be subject to a maximum of 5 years. And then Li Cheyan is actually one among these 18. On top of that, he is also the organizer of the Alliance in support of patriotic and democratic movements in China, which was set up in Hong Kong after the Tiananmen crackdown. In Hong Kong, until this past June 4th, for 30 years, Hong Kong was holding annual candlelight vigil in Victoria Park. For the first time ever in last month, then the organizers were denied a no objection permit. In Hong Kong, if you want to have a protest, you have to get a no objection permit from the police, or then you can be charged for organizing unlawful illegal assemblies. So on top of that, then Li Cheyan is also vulnerable to subversion. The national security law has 4 main areas of crime: 1, subversion; 2, secession; 3, terrorism; and 4, collusion. So Li Cheyan, by virtue of having organized all of these candlelight vigils, yelling out down with one-party dictatorship, he is vulnerable to that. Moreover, he also agreed to testify at the House Foreign Affairs Committee hearing on July 1st, when the national security law came into effect already. And that could subject him to collusion. And collusion with foreign forces carries maximum of life imprisonment. Moreover, someone like Li Cheyan could also then be extradited to across the mainland, which means that he could be executed, he could be tortured. There will be no holds bar in how he will be treated. And I've been trying to call attention to him in a way that I think that the more attention that we have on him, the better protection that he can get. And then after July 1st, there's another development is that there's this particular slogan, the most popular slogan of the protest, "Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times," that's banned. And in addition to that, so this banner, it first came out in late July last year. And then very soon, within a week's time, the Hong Kong Macau Affairs Office in Beijing already announced that, well, what is going on in Hong Kong sounds like a color revolution, and we have no tolerance for color revolution. And within a month, about the first week of August, then Hong Kong people even drafted a song, a national anthem, "Glory to Hong Kong," that incorporates Revolution of Our Times. And that song is also now banned. But for a long time, people would sing this song at different protest sites, or just in shopping malls, or just spontaneously in the street corner. Now, there's another thing that we can look at what happened last year in June, when the extradition bill was being debated in the Legislative Council of Hong Kong. First, on June 9th, 1 million people demonstrated in the street. And then on Wednesday, June 12th, tens of thousands of people surrounded the Legislative Council building, which actually managed to block legislators from entering the building, and therefore the bill could not be deliberated. And on that Saturday, the chief executive, Carrie Lam, announced that we're going to suspend the bill for a while, but then we won't withdraw it. People didn't buy it because the government has enough votes by all of those pro-Beijing, pro-regime legislators. They could always just push through any bill. And so on the next day, on June 16th, the week after June 9th, 2 million people marched on the street to continue to protest against the bill and asking for the formal withdrawal of the bill. And in addition to, you can see basically seas of people all filling out Hong Kong's very busy business streets. Another thing we have seen is also, so now let me see how I can move this in. Oh, there we go. So we can see seas of people, and also there's something very Hong Kong-like. So in addition to police firing tear gas and arresting people, we also see this very Hong Kong thing, London Wall. The idea was taken from Prague, that you just put up these sticky notes with your messages. Nobody knows who you are, but then by July and August, these London walls appear in every single corner, every single district of Hong Kong. And it essentially was a heavy morale boost for a lot of people, is that I'm not alone. In addition to me, many other people also basically we all share the same goal: getting rid of the extradition bill, bringing back Hong Kong's freedoms. And this is also what happened in the Tai Po, kind of a suburban town, Tai Po. The entire underground tunnel is just filled with all of these posters, and sometimes very more elaborate art. In a way, though, those sticky notes also tell a message of basically better hope, because, you know, on the one hand, when you go to protest, you can be arrested and also tortured and with your bones broken. But these sticky notes allow for a lot more people to participate with minimal fear until at some point. So these are what all the sticky notes are like, and they were just everywhere. Okay, so the problem is, as I said before, that Beijing very quickly announced that the protest had signs, characteristics of color revolution. So within a week after the slogan emerged, now remember that this is also the slogan, liberate Hong Kong, revolution of our times. Within a week, then Beijing said that this has a signs of color revolutions, and then within a few days after the announcement, the police began to use extreme brutality to beat up Hong Kong people. And the kind of scenes that, you know, people are pinned down, and they have broken bones, all of those are done in the full view of both the international media and the local media. The New York Times, for example, has actually done several video investigative reports, and all international media have done that. One thing is why is it that, you know, during the umbrella movement of 2014, when the police were beating people up, they would do so in dark corners. And they did not like it when somehow that they got caught on film. But this time, by the beginning of August, the police were beating people up in plain view of both local and international media, and with many also just regular citizens who would then upload the videos. That created such an outrage that a lot of young people then turned to believe that peaceful protests do not work. It's just, we have to escalate. And at the same time, they also discovered that police officers were dressed like protesters. And so once protesters themselves began to throw rocks and Molotov cocktail, then it became very difficult to know, you know, who is a protester and who is a police officer dressed as a protester. And a lot of these that they arrested, when they came out, when there have been many pictures of them, of these people, when at the moments of the arrest, they had no signs of injuries. But then when they came out on bail, or when they later on appear in the hospitals, they would have many signs of injuries, very serious injuries, broken bones, bone fractures, in some cases even brain injuries, internal bleeding. And medical workers, they were the front line of taking care of these people. They came out with this silent demonstration in August too, that the Hong Kong police are trying to kill Hong Kong citizens. And then also another thing to note is that because the police would just go to hospitals to arrest people, so many people didn't even dare go to get medical treatment. And some medical workers then would organize this underground network in different places to give at least basic minimum medical care to people with severe injuries, but managed to, not get arrested. So there are many things that I can really go about explaining how bad the national security law is. But I also want to say that almost everything that I've written, I put it on my blog. As Lynn was so kind to mention my blog, so it's victoriatbho.wordpress.com. But I want to emphasize that for a lot of people, okay, so and also Beijing's the authorities' line is that the national security law is only targeted a very tiny minority of people, especially the guys who have turned violent. The problem is that subversion, secession, terrorism, collusion, all of these crimes are very, very vague and broad. For example, terrorism, how is it defined? Blocking traffic, that counts as terrorism. It's not just about people causing any bodily harm. And then at the same time, it's not just about acts, concrete acts, but also about activities, which then include if you happen to have donated some money to a particular guy or a particular organization, is somehow they're also charged for inciting a particular protest, then all of those related people will be affected because these all count as activities. And how bad can this get? In the last week, we've heard a lot of people saying that one country, two systems, the model promised for Hong Kong is formally dead. The thing is that why this is dead, I can also go back to Deng Xiaoping's early understanding of two systems. For Hong Kong people and for the rest of the world, two systems should refer to mainland China's one-party dictatorship. And then also in Hong Kong, there should be the rule of law, the free press, freedom of expression, independent judiciary, free press, and all of those liberal values. But from day one, for Beijing, in Beijing's eye, the two systems refer to Hong Kong's capitalism and mainland China's socialism, which means that they've always tried to stifle Hong Kong's freedom and yet keeping Hong Kong's capitalism in order to help promote China's own economic growth. And they are hoping that by not actually rolling out military tanks, the rest of the world would look the other way. They actually could have achieved that because this national security law, a less harsh version without bringing in the secret police and mainland China's armed police and security forces to Hong Kong and setting up all these branches from mainland China, from Beijing, Beijing could have passed a version that's harsh enough and just shuffle it down the throat of the Legislative Council. And as I said, they always have enough votes to push through any bill. But they chose a way to do this and also chose a way to do it in the most harsh way and also having the broadest, the most vague definition of these crimes and bringing in essentially completely taking over Hong Kong with these mainland agencies and mainland Chinese leaders. Essentially, this is forcing the rest of the world that they cannot really look the other way. So that also, another thing is that as Lynn said, I've been very busy. It is true. It's like my interviews are just lined up back to back. And on Monday, when the Hong Kong government also gazetted enacted these detailed arrangements about how the national security law is going to be implemented, including, for example, that Facebook, WhatsApp, and these networks, they have to provide information, or they are subject to imprisonment and heavy fine. And also that anyone anywhere around the world especially organizations, whether in Taiwan or in the rest of the world, if they provide support to Hong Kong, then they are also subject to questioning, and they also have to provide information, or they also become criminals. So I and other fellow Hong Kongers have organized this Hong Kong Democracy Council. Have organized this Hong Kong Democracy Council. And obviously then these days it's going to basically, I will be subject to the charge of collusion, which means that I cannot go home. And on Monday, when I agreed to have an interview with the BBC, it was interesting that the producer called me back within an hour. Are you sure that you want to really talk to us? Because we don't want you to be subject to life imprisonment. As I said, I've already gone down the path, and so I just cannot go home. I cannot see my family anymore. So I guess this is kind of, let me just stop here and then take questions.
Yeah, absolutely. Very powerful presentation. Thank you for sharing this, Dr. Hui. Let me just take a moment to remind everyone. I know we've got a couple questions start coming in. I did link to your blog in the chat, so everybody can check that out once the interview is over. We've got great turnout for members on Zoom. We've got several people watching on Facebook, so put the questions into chat. We'll work those in for the members on Zoom. As I said, if you want to join live, just let me know in the chat and I'll help coordinate that. So I love the focus on the personal aspect of it. Can we, is it okay with you if we maybe take a step back and just look at the politics a little bit, and then we can come back to that more human impact?
Yeah.
And maybe this is some overlap, right? Like, why now and why so aggressively? There was this agreement in place since 1997 that would last through 2047. There was no notice. They broke that agreement. Like, why so aggressively, so quickly right now?
This is a very good question. Is that I think a lot of people have been asking why. Now, some people would say that, well, maybe actually Beijing has waited long enough, because from day one, Beijing basically really did not want to see freedom in Hong Kong. I would also say that from day one, so the Sino-British Joint Declaration that laid out the model of one country, two systems for Hong Kong people ruling Hong Kong under a high degree of autonomy. The Sino-British Joint Declaration was signed in 1984. It stipulates that all of those promises have to be included, specified in a basic law that China itself should promulgate. The basic law came out in 1991. What had transpired between 1984 and 1990 was Tiananmen. So in the mid-1980s, Deng Xiaoping and various leaders would still be traveling around the world, trying to reassure not just Hong Kong people that, you know, nothing's going to change. The only thing that's going to change is change of the flag. The British flag would come down and the Chinese PRC flag would go up. Otherwise, Hong Kong people will be assured dancing is as usual, horse racing as usual, money betting as usual. In a way that promised that Hong Kong people could continue to have to be involved in horse racing and dancing. It just reflected Chinese leaders understanding that Hong Kong people just care about making money. They have only about these decadent capitalist values. They don't really care about other things. So long as, you know, we preserve the capitalist system, then everything will be fine. They will be silent. At the same time, it is also true that Hong Kong people were not very political at the time. But then Tiananmen came. We really don't know the exact figure, but then the usual statement most people would make is that about 500,000 people pour into the street. And in the summer, Hong Kong can have torrential rains, very wet and humid and very hot. And then when you have typhoons, then it gets worse. But even during a typhoon, Hong Kong people pour into the street, not just to holding up a slogan, today's Tiananmen, tomorrow's Hong Kong. They all of a sudden felt that they were so tied to what was going on in China, because if China doesn't become more democratic, Hong Kong will have no future. But if China becomes more democratic, then Hong Kong will have a much better future. In addition to just pouring out into the street, Hong Kong people donated a lot of money, brought checks, and also camping tents to Tiananmen. And Li Cheng-yan, the guy that I'm the most worried about, he was also the one to personally fly to Beijing to deliver a check to students then. And with that, from then on, because of Hong Kong people's involvement in Tiananmen, Beijing made up its mind that we have to make Hong Kong safe for the CCP. So for all this time, essentially, there is some logic to the arguments that, well, there was never any plan for Beijing to wait until 2047. Maybe we should actually pay attention to the opposite question, why they waited that long. In a way, though, actually, I would say, the last time I was in Hong Kong, personally in Hong Kong, was the summer of 2017. By then, I was already writing that Hong Kong is dead, one country, two systems is already formally dead. Why I said that? Because Beijing also essentially compelled Hong Kong to build a high-speed railway, and also compelled the Hong Kong government to cede parts of the station to mainland jurisdiction. That just completely violated the basic law. Once that is opened up, then really any other violations would also be allowed. Also that elected legislators were disqualified. So by the time I was already saying that basically Hong Kong is already dead. But somehow that, so when a million people pour into the street on June 6th, I was surprised too. Oh no, Hong Kong people actually have not given up. And I would also say that Beijing probably had shared my view about the Hong Kong situation by 2017, 2018, that this is a time to then introduce extradition law so that we can just tear down the last pillar of Hong Kong's rule of law. Because, if in Hong Kong you are subject to the common law system, there should be trial by jury for serious crimes and all of this. But if you take people across the border, essentially they can do anything to you. And many people were very fearful of that. And because a lot of Hong Kong people saw the extradition bill as basically taking down the last pillar. So they talk about Hong Kong's last stand. I think this is why that when Beijing saw first 1 million and then 2 million, and then how the protests actually were sustained, they didn't fizzle out over the summer and then into the fall and then winter. And this is why that they are taking these harsh actions.
That's excellent context, and the way you explain it, definitely maybe better way to look at it, that it wasn't so much why now, but why did it take so long? I think it's helpful to understand that. Was it? I mean, the way you describe it sounds pretty much unavoidable, right? It was imminent. Is there anything that could have been done to negotiate, to settle this, somewhat more peacefully? I know for Hong Kong, they've got a lot at stake as a kind of global financial hub. How's that going to impact them? And what you also framed it as, socialism versus capitalism. I mean, certainly there's going to be cost to Beijing to lose this financial impact of Hong Kong. Like, how does that all balance out?
This is actually very, very important, is that it seems that Beijing is willing to really kill Hong Kong at any cost. I think if we understand that the national security law, even though the title is national security, is really about regime security. It is about the CCP's regime security. It is about Xi Jinping's personal power security. If we understand that it's that way, then I think it is much easier to see why they're willing to pay all this cost. The regulations issued on Monday are essentially telling all the international companies, the international multinational companies, that if you have a building in Hong Kong, if you hire people in Hong Kong, if you have Facebook, your WhatsApp, your whatever, these social media platform, you have to provide information when we ask you to, or then you are subject to arrest, imprisonment, and also confiscation of your assets. So essentially, I would say that Beijing used to really take Hong Kong's international connectedness, its international status, as an asset to help China develop its economy. Now, China probably thinks that we don't care about this. All the international assets in Hong Kong, we can take hostage of them and compel them to then follow China's rules. This is very scary. And then it also goes back to your original question. if this seems to be, if we turn around the question, why, why Beijing actually waited this long, all of those protests in vain. Hong Kong people who have been protesting basically, since the 1980s. I said that I was there in the first ever convention of all the pro-democracy forces in 1987. So are these efforts all in vain? Well, that's one answer I would say is, if the writing is on the wall, at least Hong Kong people have told the world that we'll try our best. And we're not going to fall without putting up a fight.
You mentioned the international support that they finally decided they could control, right? You've got Taiwan in the region, you've got the international influence, and there's a lot of questions about this. Chris Woolert, board member, asked what is our State Department's position, and what are the action or policy statements that have been released. So what are we seeing in terms of Taiwan support? Maybe preparing to deal with refugees even, and then international support and the US specifically?
That's great. Thank you so much for repeating that question. I actually overlooked it. So the one earlier question you raised is, can the rest of the world do something about it? Renegotiate the treaty or anything? Well, the thing is that the Sino-British Joint Declaration was actually written basically gave Hong Kong people a lot of promises. At the same time, we also have to keep in mind that it was London and Beijing negotiating over the back of Hong Kong, over the future of a population who were not asked to be involved. So people were very, very worried. I remember when I was basically in my teenage years, that there were bank runs and people were panicking. And then when the Sino-British Joint Declaration came out, many people felt relief. They were willing to give the promises, basically, benefits of the doubt. Since we have no choice, we may as well try to hope for the best. So if Beijing now have violated an international treaty, vowed with the United Nations, can the UK do something about it? In a way that we also understand that in international law, you really need all the participants, these are all sovereign states, to accede to international jurisdiction. Let's take China to the International Court of Justice, but if China doesn't really agree to the ICJ's jurisdiction, you can't really go very far. But I have also been hearing from people that, well, even if China is not going to play the game, of course, we don't expect it to, but at least if the UN or ICJ issue resolutions, that will still be significant. And that turns to another question: what can people actually do now? And this is what the Hong Kong Democracy Council has been trying to do. I would say that we are the poorest, at the same time also the most effective lobby in DC. We happen to have one person who is originally from Hong Kong, came to the US during high school, Samuel Chu, and then he actually became somewhat familiar with the legislative process. And in fall, when we set up the Hong Kong Democracy Council in September last year, and for several months, he just came out and he got to know just about every single members of Congress and all the staffers. And we managed to get the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act passed. The act was originally introduced during the umbrella movement in 2014. Every single year, when Rubio wanted to retable it, it was always shuffled to the side because the business lobby, all of the American business interests in Hong Kong, they were all in China, were all lobbying against it until last year, both because of the massiveness of the Hong Kong protests, and also because by last year, DC was already having this quote unquote China reckoning. At the same time, a lot of those businesses, they had their systems and designs and innovations hacked into, stolen, were all trying to keep silent, hoping that they would, finally make some profits out of the China market. They had all come around. So this is why the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act could pass. And at the same time, based on the Hong Kong Human Rights and Democracy Act, we also managed to get another act which kind of duplicates the original act, the Hong Kong Autonomy Act. It was passed by both the Senate and the House 10 days or so ago. And that is going to, that provides for imposing sanctions on Chinese leaders. And the Department of State also decertified Hong Kong's autonomous status. And the the administration has taken two, I would say, baby steps. The first step is to impose visa restrictions on Chinese leaders. I would say that this is a very, very baby step because, for example, Xi Jinping's daughter graduated from Harvard quite a number of years ago. He doesn't have another kid who wants to go to Harvard. And so imposing visa restriction on these Chinese leaders really doesn't mean much. And then another concrete measure that they've done is to stop allowing dual-use technologies to be transported to Hong Kong, because a lot of those dual-use technologies would then be turned around and shipped to Hong Kong when there's a ban on exporting these technologies to China. But Hong Kong has enjoyed an autonomous status. So until recently, that these would all be going to Hong Kong, and then state-owned enterprises have taken advantage of that. And what we're also pushing for is the Hong Kong a Safe Harbor Act, and a very similar act is the Hong Kong People Freedom and Choice Act. These two acts that we are trying to push to get passed, they provide for allow Hong Kong people to seek asylum and refugee status. So hopefully, the audience here can go to the HKDC site, go to Facebook and check, or just search it. And we are launching an email campaign. Email your representative, your members of Congress, your senators, to support it, to co-sponsor it.
Yeah, maybe somebody could even who's on the presentation could look that up and put it into chat while we're live here. If not, we can follow up after the presentation. And I'm glad you touched on that, because Zane had asked in chat, is the U.S. even going to do anything based on our State Department leadership right now? So it sounds like certainly the federal government is taking action, the State Department specifically, a couple small steps, and we may see some additional pressure mount to take action there. So that's good news. So if we start to move back towards the humanitarian side of it, Rick asks, do we see this as human rights in China decreasing as a whole? And what do you predict for the future on that front?
I would say that the trend in China, inside China, has been going from bad to worse. And so today is July 8th. So July 9th, by tomorrow is going to be the 5th anniversary of a big 709 sweep of all the rights defense lawyers in China. China, for a long time after the Tiananmen crackdown, they've done something very ingenious. They would tell people to shut up on the one hand, and then also develop the economy. So if you make money, from now on, you can send, for example, your kids to Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and you can afford all of those. Then a lot of people willing to just shut up, and then journalist Louisa Lim has written a very, very good book, The Tiananmen Amnesia, Republic of Amnesia. A lot of people, you would think that, if people have their own family members and relatives who were killed or disappear during the crackdown, they would want to refuse to forget about what happened. But a lot of people actually have chosen to just move on, because, today's life is better, so why look back? And they were hoping that this would continue to be the case, except that then, so a number of years later, you would have a new generation of rights defense lawyers who then came out to defend. So workers who have worked for a whole year, because in China, that these migrant workers, they will work for the whole year, and then they start to be paid right before Chinese New Year, and then they bring the money and bring all the goodies back to their home villages. Very often, some of those work, because a lot of those projects go through many layers of subcontractors. Some of these workers don't get paid, and they will go to these rights defense lawyers. And then you also have peasants who have lands taken from them with minimum or sometimes no compensation. They would also go to these rights defense lawyers. Falun Gong practitioners, they are persecuted, so they would also go to rights defense lawyers. Uyghurs and Tibetans who are persecuted, again, these rights defense lawyers would be so brave to take up the cases. Now, of course, we're talking about this very small minority of very brave people who are still willing to challenge the regime. And at the same time, they said that we are really looking at what the Constitution offers. And what's the whole long list of these different administrative laws says that, people are supposed to be given this or that protection. They should be properly compensated. They should not be charged this or that excessive fee in all of this. Just by taking the Constitution or the regime's own laws very seriously, they've been getting into trouble. And so 5 years ago, pretty much about 200 some of these rights defense lawyers were all arrested in one incident. And this is likely to also happen in Hong Kong. And not just that, another thing is also in Xinjiang. So several years ago, that it also began I should go back to in 2009. There were these massive protests in Xinjiang, and also in 2008, also protests in Tibet. From then on, even before Xi Jinping came to power, Beijing was starting to crack down really hard on Tibet and Xinjiang. Now, why, going back to what I kind of didn't elaborate on earlier, why I would say that, many people would say Hong Kong is just, if Hong Kong loses the one country, two systems model, if Hong Kong just becomes another Chinese city, why is it that bad? We can look at Shanghai. A lot of us have, visited Shanghai. If Hong Kong becomes like Shanghai, Shanghai has been thriving. Why? What's the worry? The problem is that, as I mentioned before, in Han China, you have really only a minority of people who are willing to speak up. And all of those, most of those have actually already been silenced. And then at the same time, a lot of these Han Chinese also agree with the regime because, things are good. The economy is great. We're taking over, basically catching up with, maybe even taking over the United States. So we are very proud of the CCP's achievements. Whereas Hong Kong actually shares a very important characteristic with Xinjiang and Tibet is the increasing distinctive identity. This is why the first thing that the Hong Kong authorities wanted to ban are the slogans, Revolution of Our Times, Liberate Hong Kong, and the Hong Kong protest anthem, because they mobilize people to even make the Hong Kong identity even stronger. How do you silence the majority, not the minority? How do you silence people who have developed this distinctive identity and with a very strong will to resist? We want to tell the world that we are not going to fall without putting up a good fight. I don't know how this is going to play out because we're still only, several days into the announcement of the law. But I fear that Hong Kong is going to descend into Tibet or Xinjiang if the rest of the world doesn't pay enough attention to it. And then Beijing is going to wait for another moment when the world is looking the other way, maybe if the coronavirus gets worse in the US and Europe, in the UK, or waiting until, another Christmas Day because, on Christmas Day, Americans and Europeans are all on holiday, so they don't really read the news and journalists are not working, and then to have a major crackdown in Hong Kong.
Yeah, and it's, you mentioned Tibet, so common pattern, something we've seen before. And unfortunately, an effective strategy, this kind of two-sided or two-faced approach to say, we'll crush the protests, but let people do okay economically, because if it doesn't affect me, then maybe I don't care so much, or I'm not going to be as vocal or as aggressive in defending people who are more impacted. The poor, targeting the poor is easy because they have less power to come back. So excellent context there. Thanks for sharing that, Dr. Hui. So I think probably we'll move back to the more humanitarian side. And I noticed Saul tried to ask a question in chat. I'm not totally sure that came through as expected. So if you want to unmute yourself and ask the question, maybe we handle it that way. What do you think, Saul?
Okay. Well, I think you've already been addressing it, but because other areas of China, the Uyghurs, if I'm saying it correctly, Tibet, as you mentioned, and of course, Taiwan considers itself part of China. What are the parallels or what are the big differences between the way the central government is addressing those areas and what you see here in Hong Kong?
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Since we haven't really touched on Taiwan, so thank you for the question. The one country, two systems model is taken from the Chinese Constitution, Article 31. And early on, Beijing already, Chinese CCP already had the plan to find a way to quote and unquote reunify Taiwan. So offering Taiwan this one country, two systems model that we take back sovereignty, but then you guys can maintain everything else. You can have autonomous rule except for foreign affairs, and also you cannot have your own military. And then somehow that's the debate, the discussion over Hong Kong emerged first. And so then the idea of one country, two systems was applied to Hong Kong first and then to Macau. And for quite a long time, I would say me included, that because we didn't have a choice, and therefore if we have to just accept the reality, then maybe if Beijing really wants to, quote unquote, peacefully reunify Taiwan, that they should treat Hong Kong, not too badly, so that they can convince Taiwanese that, there is a future. Now, of course, with the protest last year, then in January, there was the elections in Taiwan. And Tsai Ing-wen, the sitting president, was campaigning on the slogan, "Today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan." She won in a landslide. And a lot of Hong Kong people who had already fled to Taiwan, because, and I would say until now, probably, I'm not sure if people can still do it now, because Hong Kong has a lot of harbor and there are a lot of, has very extended shorelines. So some of those who were under who were on the police watch list, they managed to get out by just taking a small speedboat and into the open sea, and then they could arrive in Taiwan. So a lot of those people were also campaigning on behalf of Tsai Ing-wen, "Today's Hong Kong, tomorrow's Taiwan." And there's a lot of talk that, okay, so from Tibet to Xinjiang and now Hong Kong, if the rest of the world would continue to look the other way, just like, the world pretty much issue only condemnations about the quote unquote re-education camps, if Beijing is doing the same to Hong Kong and no one cares, then the next target is Taiwan. So yesterday I read a commentary in the Washington Post, and there's basically a talk that some of these Chinese leaders, very prominent Chinese opinion leaders, not exactly Chinese leaders themselves, were already talking about it. And today there's another article that came out in Foreign Affairs also talking about Taiwan is next. I do believe that Taiwan is going to be next. And so paying attention to Hong Kong is very important. And I've seen also scholars of international relations for quite a while saying that, well, so what if China takes back Taiwan? Shouldn't the US, just move out of the Western Pacific and leave the backyard in Asia of China's, basically China's backyard back to China? So why do we care? It's not just about the values of, the importance of Taiwan being a very vibrant democracy and people, and also a population that's very, very pro-American. But also that if we look at the map, we can see that Taiwan is basically like an unsinkable aircraft carrier. The sad thing is that why Taiwan can also be next is the military balance between China along its coastline and the US ability to project power in the Western Pacific has changed so much in the last few years. A lot of analysts, military analysts, would say that if China is to invade Taiwan today, it would be very difficult for the US to defend it, even if Americans are willing to sacrifice the money and the human lives. This is why Taiwan is sure to be next.
I think you might have mentioned this before. I know you mentioned Article 21. In 2003, there was Article 23. Did that kind of set the stage for where we are now? Like, what's the context around how we went from there to here?
Well, thank you so much. Yeah, that is actually a very important thing. So I would say that the most important part was Tiananmen, the Hong Kong people pouring out the money and support for the students in China. And then the next major, this is why the Basic Law, when it came out, while on the surface it looks like it is, copying and pasting a lot of the guarantees for free speech and stuff from the Joint Declaration into the Basic Law. But the Basic Law also includes a lot of these clauses that allow, for example, the National People's Congress Standing Committee to interpret anything. And Beijing has actually exercised that power of interpretation multiple times. It also then sneaking through the back door, this possibility of Beijing imposing a national law on Hong Kong. And then on top of that, 2003 is important. So the Basic Law stipulates that, Article 23 stipulates that Hong Kong has to enact a national security law on its own. So several years after the handover, so Hong Kong was handed back to China in 1997. Several years after the handover, by 2002, the first chief executive, Tong Chi-hua, decided that, or he was instructed that this is about time to introduce national security law. Half a million people pour into the street. And at the time, the Liberal Party that represented more or less business interests in Hong Kong James Tan, the chair, said, I went to dinner and then I looked at these seas of people in black. They control 4 votes, 4 very critical votes. And then he said, he turned around and said, sorry, I cannot support this bill because Hong Kong until now has limited democracy. Some of the seats are open to geographical elections. And so these guys wanted to get elected. So sorry, we cannot support the bill. So the bill was shelved. But from then on, while Hong Kong people took that as a victory, that people power can actually, help to keep our freedoms. But Beijing did not take it lightly. From then on, they created the liaison office based in Hong Kong. And the liaison office, we've all known that they've had essentially people trying to control elections from behind the scenes, supporting the people, being loyal and reliable, and also making calls to other legislators. Do you guys want business contracts, or do you want to, really speak your mind or vote according to your mind and all of that? At the same time, over the past few years, there were already several cases of extradition. And for example, a bookseller was kidnapped from Hong Kong and taken across the border in the early part of 2016. Another mainland business tycoon was also kidnapped. So a lot of those have happened under the radar. What the national security law this time allows Beijing to do is to allow all of these secret agents to just basically operate in Hong Kong legally and formally and emerge from the surface in much higher numbers, and also literally just open shop in Hong Kong. And you're quite right, 2003 did lay down the seed for today.
So if we stick with the power of the people, right, the protests a little bit, and then I'll come back to the questions from Peter and Randy from the chat. So we've had a kind of extended period of protests. We just had not too long ago the 31st anniversary of Tiananmen Square. If we look kind of over the past year, there were five demands made by the protesters. It sounds like the Tiananmen Square protest was another catalyzing event. What's the escalation, or what's the evolution from there?
Okay, great. I think we should go back to the umbrella movement's demand. In 2014, people poured into the streets because the basic law also stipulates how the chief executive and the legislative council should be composed of up to 2007/2008. So in about 2004, once people had kind of quote unquote defeated the attempts to impose the national security law on Hong Kong through the Hong Kong's legislature, then people began to ask for genuine universal suffrage. Because if you don't specify how the chief executive should be elected or selected, and the legislative council, how it should be composed of afterwards, and the basic law also stipulates that the ultimate aim is universal suffrage, then it means that we should be able to have genuine universal suffrage from 2007, 2008 on. Well, then once the demands became very clear and loud, Beijing issued a decision saying that we're not ready in a few years' time. Let's just wait for another 10 years. So when we got close enough to 2017/2018, Benny Tai, a Hong Kong law professor, he said that let's actually give the government some pressure to really implement the promise. We've been waiting for another decade, so let's have genuine universal suffrage. So the rallying call at the time was, we want genuine universal suffrage. But Beijing then, in the summer of 2014, issued another decision, a white paper, saying that we are going to have comprehensive jurisdiction over Hong Kong. You guys can have one person, one vote, but we're going to have a screening committee to screen out, to allow only two to three candidates for you guys to vote on. People didn't accept that, because essentially we're just talking about these two Beijing appointees. That would be like Iran-style election. It wouldn't need to be meaningful. The umbrella movement was suppressed, and so then what happened this time last year with the anti-extradition protest was 5 demands, not one less. The first demand was the formal withdrawal of the extradition law because it was suspended with protests, but it was not withdrawn until September 4th of last year. I remember that, the exact dates, because I was testifying at Congress USCC committee And it was the same morning that we got the news that it was formally withdrawn. But by that time, so on that Wednesday, when tens of thousands of protesters were surrounding the Legislative Council, there was already very good, strong evidence of police abuses of power. So another demand is to have independent investigation into police abuses. However, police abuses, brutality only escalated, as I talked about earlier, that once the national anthem came out, the police just really stepped up, beating people up in the full light of international and local media. And then also that they also wanted to revive the demand for genuine universal suffrage. And of course, we now know why that this is, Beijing would never allow genuine universal suffrage, because with the current chief executive, Carrie Lam, she has been basically the Beijing's puppet. She's implementing everything that Beijing asked her to. If there's any democracy in Hong Kong, then Beijing cannot control Hong Kong. So essentially, those promises made in the basic law were not really meant to be what they, how people would read these letters in black and white.
Well, so we're at close to an hour, and I think it's worth noting that I don't think we've lost a single viewer from either the Zoom meeting or from Facebook. A lot of interest in this topic, and I personally want to say, I really appreciate both the depth and breadth of your knowledge. I feel like we've covered a lot of topics here, and your willingness to sit and share this with us. Do you have a few more minutes?
Yes.
Are we okay? Okay, so a group of questions about the personal impact, I think, for you. You had mentioned Martin Lee specifically as kind of the person that you're most concerned about. Can you share anything about the status of Joshua Wong, the Secretary General of the Pro-Democracy Party?
Oh yeah, so Joshua Wong, we should also note that he is very impressive, because he began, he came to fame when he was only like 15 years old. In 2012, when the government wanted to impose quote unquote national education, essentially the kind of mainland style patriotic education, Beijing has always been complaining that Hong Kong has been handed over back to Beijing, but yet the hearts of the people have not really been returned. And so imposing national education is a very important part of that. When the government wanted to impose national education in 2012, Joshua Wong was just a high school kid, and he came out to organize scholar with a bunch of just high school kids, and then they managed to get 100,000 people to protest, and the government shelved the policy. And then he turned 18 during the umbrella movement in 2014. And after the umbrella movements, they turned their group into a political party, Demosisto. And just hours before the enactment of the national security law on June 30th, they disbanded Demosisto. And essentially, the whole idea is to make sure that, we don't have the party, we don't have any members anymore. So if you want to persecute us, then it will be a lot harder. But I would also say that while I'm very worried about Joshua Wong and Martin Lee, Joshua Wong is definitely very high on the list of people that Beijing hates the most. Why? Two people have been the most effective in lobbying for international support, international attention to Hong Kong. So Martin Lee, the first person. And then over time, Martin would bring along other pro-democracy leaders along to DC or London or Paris or Berlin. And then Joshua would be the youngest person that Martin would bring along. And then Joshua, he himself, over time, has also developed his own network. And so the charge of collusion is very likely to be applied to him. So I also urge everyone to keep your eyes on Joshua, because if the world takes our eyes off from these very important people, they could well be taken, not to the already very scary National Security Court of Hong Kong, but taken across the border, where they will be subject to all kinds of torture and even execution.
And to this idea of persecution, Peter Sheridan asks that so I had heard recently that a new law states that if I swear on the internet I'm breaking the law in Hong Kong, and can be arrested if I visit Hong Kong. Can you talk about these laws? Randy Noonan, on a similar note, asks, you had mentioned that you couldn't return to Hong Kong. concerned about retaliation against family members in Hong Kong? Like, what's the travel implication and implication of kind of events outside affecting people inside?
Yeah, that is very important. So once the law is enforced, which means now the law is enforced. So if any, it's not that you're swearing about Hong Kong, but then if you use any swearing words that go with some of the protest slogans, a lot of the protest slogans also include swearing words. And if you criticize the government or you provide some kind of support to the people that they don't like, you know, Joshua Wong, Martin Lee, whatever, then you are subject to the crime of collusion or subversion. And yes, Beijing, the national security law says that this law applies to residents and non-residents alike. And whether the act or the activity are committed inside Hong Kong, inside China, or outside. And so if you also, you know, criticize Beijing then you better not travel to China. But I would say that for most people, it doesn't matter as much. You know, for example, most of the people who are listening now, and including you probably don't have a lot of plans to go to Shanghai or Hong Kong, so it doesn't matter. You're right, it applies particularly to us, Hong Kongers, who have been lobbying so hard precisely because people inside cannot lobby anymore. And therefore, the burden on us is even heavier than before, and we actually have to step up all that effort. And do I worry about my family? So I am a little worried, but at the same time, they're also not very political. And my husband, my daughter are here in the U.S. In fact, so I'm American actually through marriage, and so we don't think that we can go back until, you know, something major change happens, miracle happens.
But I think to the question, you don't necessarily have a strong concern that your politics in the U.S. could affect your extended family in Hong Kong.
I am concerned, but then sometimes you just have to do the right thing. So as I said before, after I agreed to appear on BBC News, that the producer called me back, are you worried? I think that a lot of people worried. I know that a lot of Hong Kongers, so we actually are pretty organized now, that we have groups in all the big cities. And there are a lot of those local groups, when they go protest, for example, they put on masks, they cover their identities, or they take pictures from the back. So that, because a lot of them have either the family members not just in Hong Kong, but also in China, or some of them have jobs that require them to travel to mainland China. So they don't really want to reveal the identity, which means that there are not many people who can actually speak up. And so for me, it is very important. If I don't speak up, then more and more people are afraid, then Beijing wins.
Just as a side note, as we go through here, Kevin Calabria says in the chat, as a Notre Dame graduate, he would like to thank you for a very informative presentation.
Thank you. Go Irish.
So if we look at, you mentioned, maybe it was even before we started recording, about the travel documents being confiscated from the protesters. What about other groups within Hong Kong, the clergy, academics who supported the democratic efforts? What are the same kind of crackdown? How are they being affected, maybe uniquely?
Yes, this is actually very important too, is that I've also written on Beijing's hard and soft repression in Hong Kong, because we tend to see a lot, you know, how the police are beating people up, breaking their bones just in the street, but there's also soft repression. For example, the medical workers, what I would call the other frontliners, they are there not because they're protesting, but because they have to do their job as professionals. So firefighters, some of them are arrested or they got into trouble because they put out, for example, a sign, "Go Hong Kong" on their Facebook, and then the colleagues report on them. Or they would do something and basically blocking the police from arresting people, or they would try to save people who were beaten down or who got injured during a police operation. And medical workers who held up these signs, Hong Kong police attempting to murder Hong Kong citizens. And journalists, they also are targeted these days, because without these people, without journalists, without rights defense lawyers in Hong Kong's pro bono lawyers, without medical workers, without all of these firefighters, then what's being done to protesters, the rest of the world would not know, and they will also just be left to die. And this is why that then Beijing has also been, the authorities have also been using quote unquote soft repression. Soft repression, you may not get arrested, you may not be imprisoned, you may not suffer from any physical injuries, but then you may be dismissed. So teachers, there's been already a growing list of teachers who are dismissed because, for example, if they have ever put out a sign, 5 demands not 1 less, or they say something in class, but even when it is not really in class, they say something on their Facebook message. Another very scary thing is that Beijing is also applying this system of informers to Hong Kong. In any society, as you know, the literature on domination resistance will tell us that you cannot send a police officer to police every single street corner, every single household, but then you can make the people dominate one another. You make them exploit each other. Then you can achieve the ultimate aim of domination. And this is a very important part. And then also that just in the last few days, the authorities also, one, they pull out books. So we talk about Joshua Wong. His book is now pulled out of public libraries, along with some other books. And then authorities also were telling all the university libraries that you guys have to review your collections. Make sure there's nothing that promotes any subversive activities or any of those banned slogans. And at the same time, and also that precisely because, you know, if people outside of Hong Kong are already so worried about criticizing the law, we can imagine what it is like for academics in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I'm sure. And so beyond normal oppression, right now they've been struggling with years of protests, this intense crackdown now. Are we seeing any of the mental health impacts on the residents and people of Hong Kong?
Yes, already in fall last year, psychologists and psychiatrists, they were already conducting surveys that Hong Kong people, they suffer from this post-traumatic syndrome on a very large scale. I have another colleague, there's another Hong Kong academic from Hong Kong in sociology. She says she had this title of her talk, A Year of Sleepless Nights. I would say that many people have not been able to sleep very well or have nightmares about anything. And so, yes, it is a very, very big issue. It is very important to understand the Hong Kong people, the slogan, Liberate Hong Kong, Revolution of Our Times, Beijing takes that as a sign of color revolution. But what it really means for Hong Kong people is that we want to liberate the Hong Kong as we used to know it. We want to liberate the Hong Kong. We want to restore Hong Kong to the old days when we could speak our minds, when we could do everything. Those happy days that, you know, we could just, the days when we had freedoms, the days when, I remember when I was a kid that we would actually call these police officers police auntie and police uncles. Can you help me? Can you reunite with my mommy if I get separated from my parents? Not anymore.
And these are impacts that are going to last for generations, like even beyond, you know, the normal conditions, which is as bad as they are, is pretty brutal.
Definitely. So especially. Go ahead.
No, I mean, so we again appreciate your time here. I think maybe this is where we can kind of land the plane. You towards the end just now started to talk about some, you know, what you would like to see happen, what the protesters want. But I think I've heard you say a couple of times throughout the presentation, Hong Kong is already dead. What hope is there? What can still be done?
Okay, let me revise that. One country, two systems is dead.
Okay.
It's basically Hong Kong is descending into something very similar to Xinjiang and Tibet. But this descent can be either slowed down or even reversed if, you know, the rest of the world can actually join forces to keep a very close eye on Hong Kong and also translate those verbal condemnations into concrete actions. And at the same time, I also insist that Hong Kong is not dead unless the people give it up. And I'm pretty certain that Hong Kong people are not giving up. So there are many of us, who are still willing to show our faces and talk about Hong Kong and lobby for support. At the same time, even in Hong Kong, I've also been talking about, it's also very interesting that right before the national security law came into effect, you saw a lot of Hong Kong people quoting these books on totalitarianism, that how do you survive? How do you live through this dark age? We are talking about Hong Kong becoming even more repressive than apartheid era South Africa, or Prague during the Soviet occupation, or Myanmar when Aung San Suu Kyi was under house arrest. But at the same time, we should also learn from Aung San Suu Kyi before she became a defender of genocide, that she was also championing the freedom from fear. Don't be too fearful, because fearlessness is actually your strongest weapon. And then there are also these little tips of how, everyone just make sure that you continue to live a normal life. Don't do anything different. Get up in the morning, continue to basically act like a professional. If you're a journalist, if you're a teacher, you're a professor, you're a student, you are a writer, continue with your life. And if you cannot have any concentrated means of protest, you can, because the police will never grant you no objection permits these days. Everything will become illegal. Then take decentralized methods. If you will be arrested, even when you're holding up signs, blank sheets of paper, because the slogans are banned, so people don't know that what slogans would be banned next. So they began to protest with just blank sheets of paper. And even those people have been arrested. Then don't go out to the street. Everyone light a candle by the window every night. Everyone also try to integrate whatever methods of resistance in your daily life. And we talked about earlier how the informant system is a way to allow people to exploit each other, to dominate themselves, because the police can never have enough manpower to police every single household. Volunteer in community activity to maintain the level of trust, to maintain the idea of shared identity, or even if in concentration camp, the people make eye contact. So there have been a lot of this kind of commentaries talking about how to survive this. We know that even South Africa, even apartheid, even the Hunter regime, and even whatever happened to Prague, there's always light at the end of the tunnel. So people are going to fight to make sure that they can survive this when the lights comes back on again.
Strong place to end. I appreciate that. Some hard fought lessons learned that we might even be able to apply closer to home. I really appreciate the conversation. Thank you so much for spending the time with us today, Dr. Hui. And I will turn the meeting over to our new president, Dr. Solomon Lausch, for some final thoughts and to wrap things up. You just make sure you unmute yourself, Sol.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Hui, very, very much. You've really held people's attentions, and you've reinforced for us and underscored the drama and what is at stake and for the whole message of freedom in the world. So thank you very much. We do have upcoming programs, and let me just highlight them a bit for you. July 29 at noon, we have the State of the State Department with Lawrence Cohen, a retired diplomat with the U.S. State Department, and he's a current member of our World Affairs Council of Reading Board of Directors, and he's presented to us previously on other matters. We think it'll be a very fine presentation for us and some insights into the State Department today. August 5 at noon, our topic is Ukraine and Russia with retired Ambassador John Herbst, retired from the United States Foreign Service, including having served as ambassador in the Ukraine during the presidency of George W. Bush. August 19, a different time, 10 a.m., we have a presentation coming through us cited in Japan, thus the time difference. Clash of Cultures, China's Expansion and the Steppe People of Central Asia by Nicholas Millward, who is a active United States Marine stationed there, but also president of the Yokosuka Council of Asia Pacific Studies. So we think a very fine set of 3 speakers coming up in the next within these next 6 weeks. We hope you can all join us. Thank you.
And we